Thank you indeed for that very generous and warm welcome. And I must say, I feel very honoured and privileged to be talking with you this afternoon. I'm on a different time zone in Australia, as you probably appreciate. So I'm actually in a hotel room in my national capital in Canberra, Australia, because I'm attending the conference of the Public Policy Association of Australia. So when I was invited to speak with you today, we negotiated some very broad themes, all of which I have done some work on in my time, both as a research scholar and as a public policy practitioner working in government. And what I have to say today is not about my own country, it's about countries in general. I'm very conscious that I'm speaking with a UNESCO audience, which is a very broad-based international organisation, and various countries have quite different histories, different interests and capabilities, but you all have an interest in UNESCO in joining together to share knowledge and to think about tackling the complex problems that the world is facing, and to put together a principled approach which includes social equity issues and environmental issues, as well as the more traditional agendas of economic development. So could I have the next slide, please? So one of the things that I was interested in recent years is the way in which international organisations such as the United Nations have responded to global problems, the crisis problems of the modern era, such as the COVID-19 crisis. And we have all lived through nearly 3 years of this. But what I want to draw attention to as a scholar who's interested in spanning the government sector and the research sector and the social sector is to remind us all of the comments very early in the COVID crisis from the UN Secretary General, who talked about the need for shared responsibility and global solidarity in responding to the crisis. On the one hand, there were the immediate health responses to do with preventing the transmission of the virus as much as we possibly could, but also, very importantly, to look at the other dimensions beyond a narrow technical focus on health and suppression of the virus, the social dimensions, the issues about the differential impact of the crisis on different parts of society, whether it's about women, whether it's about young people, whether it's about low-wage workers who have a precarious income, small business, the informal economic sector, and a vast array of vulnerable groups that are already at risk, including people with health issues, disability, the aged, and so forth. And at the same time, it's even more complex because it's not just about health and social impacts, it's also about the economy. It's about the need to keep the economy moving as much as practicable to protect and nurture the livelihoods of ordinary people. And at the same time, there's the knowledge and research piece about what are we learning about how to respond to massive problems that are so complicated and which are evolving over time, and the need for us to prepare not just for issues about transmission of disease, but to build back better in the future once we are on top of the health crisis in that narrow sense. Next slide, please. So you're all very familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. And in my teaching and research, I do quite a lot of work on some of these 17 elements of the SDGs. The issue of peace and so on in box 16 here is only one of 17 elements. And it's very hard, as we all know, to pursue social and economic and environmental goals if we don't have social stability and a peaceful world. So all of these issues interact very forcibly, and it's very difficult to make a lot of progress on just a single one without taking into account the impacts from the other areas. And that, to me, is one reason why international organisations such as UNESCO and several others are so important in sharing accounts of what works, of what's the knowledge base, particularly around developing shared goals and strategies and partnerships to help each other to deal with these very pressing, complex problems. Next slide, please. So as we go forward, a number of researchers have been thinking about how do we deal with complex and interconnected problems. Some authors have talked about the messiness, the entangled nature of these problems. How is it possible to separate out the different characteristics of the problems when they're all mixed up together? How can we analyse and address these complex and messy realities? And for me, part of the answer is about the knowledge base, which is where research centres and institutes and workshops to think about how to address complex problems become so important. And again, why international bodies like UNESCO play a big role in these sorts of areas. Next slide, please. So part of my own work in recent years has been about how do we address these complex realities. Can I have the next slide, please? We all know that some issues are relatively easier to deal with than others. We all know that governments have a role, a special role, in trying to work out how to address the issues for their own population, but also to cooperate with other governments in a global community or a regional area to help deal with common interests and to share various strategies that might help each other deal with these very big things. There are many countervailing tendencies that get in the way of successful engagement with these big problems. You all know these things very, very well. What I do in my own research and teaching is to say we should expect that people will disagree and that they will have different interests. I mention a few here in this slide, different loyalties, interests, values, standards, and so forth. And in some cases, there is a political exaggeration or amplification of these differences for various kinds of partisan purposes. So that the very nature of problems and the preferred solutions becomes hotly debated and hotly contested. And what I would suggest to you is that many countries have now developed an institutionalised preference for dealing with conflict, to reduce conflict and to produce more shared goals and directions, and to take seriously the need for stakeholder inclusion in a very wide sense of stakeholders, including the poor and the powerless and the marginalised, and importantly for the research community, but also for international organisations concerned with knowledge, using best available knowledge and evidence to help develop effective policy choices. And to do this in a way that respects the need for social cohesion and environmental sustainability. These are big issues. Some years ago, the OECD came out with an agenda for inclusive growth, and I think that has been taken up by a large variety of organisations internationally and regionally. And it's really bringing together the need for a broad-based approach, which goes beyond simply economic growth in the sense of gross domestic product, but looking at the quality of life, looking at making sure that people who are disadvantaged are brought inside the tent, so to speak, for dealing with complex problems. And finally, I mention here that these diverse debates and problem-solving strategies have been addressed recently in some research on wicked problems, so-called. Next slide, please. So one of the reasons that I'm speaking with you today is because I brought out a recent book which tries to pull together some of this thinking. This is no doubt terrible self-publicity, but on the other hand, I mentioned quickly that this is a free book. It's widely available. It can be downloaded by anyone globally. And the argument is that policy improvements on these complex and contested problems, improvement is always possible. We must strive to improve things. But in seeking solutions, this requires a lot of hard work, a lot of collaboration, and a lot of resilience to deal with the inevitable setbacks and difficulties that we find as we go along the way. And we need to harness together a number of perspectives across this broad terrain, whether it's social and political thinking, whether it's economic analysis, whether it's social ethics, and of course, ecological perspectives. Next slide, please. So when I've been a public servant working in government, and when I've been working as the leader of a not-for-profit organisation, and when I've been a research professor in the university sector, there's always a lot of debate about whether we can find a solution to a problem. And we always hope that there is a relatively straightforward or simple way through each policy puzzle or policy challenge. But very often we find, as the Sustainable Development Goals show us, these solutions are quite elusive. They take a lot of effort and a lot of discussion. Next slide, please. And so in reality, we do rational planning, which is in the first diagram. We say, here's our goal, here's the pathway that we want to take. But in fact, we find in reality that real life is much more complex. It's marked by complexities, uncertainties, various kinds of conflicts. And the response that we need to take is therefore a flexible and adaptive approach. We need some leadership on shared goals and strategies. We need resilience to deal with the ups and downs and the setbacks. But we also need a lot of skill in developing knowledge and good communication about how to go forward in a collective way. Next slide, please. So some of the work I've been doing recently as an analyst, as a researcher, is about various notions of complexity. Now, there's nothing I can say on this that you don't already know, but let me remind you very, very quickly of what we're talking about when we are talking about issues being complex. And it might be any or all of these things. I've just mentioned 6 things here, some of which will strike a chord with some of you. So in a complex issue, there may be many elements that are interacting. They may be very many causal variables that we need to analyse. There may be various levels of analysis that we need to look at within an interacting system. Many actors or people involved, stakeholders and so forth, decision makers, but also the people who are impacted by policies. Many possible response actions or preferred solutions, if you like. And of course, complexities arising from rapid change, because issues tend not to stand still. They tend to be developing and evolving as we go along. And a number of writers have talked about the more controversial and conflictual elements of complex problems and called the wicked problems. Wicked because they are hard to tame, they are hard to control, they are hard to manage. And they are particularly around areas where the various actors have different interests and values and perspectives, and therefore there's a range of different perceptions about the issues and the solutions. And of course, as we saw in the diagram of Sustainable Development Goals, these issues tend to be very interactive and interdependent. So this is a very large agenda for both understanding and developing policy solutions and collaborating together to make some kind of progress. Next slide, please. So I won't spend time on this, but a number of people have asked me over the years, well, what do you mean by wicked problems? And my simple answer is they're the most difficult problems where the issues are marked by complexity in the sense I was describing it, issues about knowledge uncertainty. We don't have full or comprehensive knowledge, and where there are divergent values about how to proceed and how to get some agreement about pathways for the future. Next slide, please. So in my more recent work as an academic analyst of public policy, I sometimes get quite concerned that governments sometimes don't make the right decisions. And of course, that's a bit of a value judgment on my own part, that in my view, sometimes governments make good decisions and sometimes less than good decisions. And what we're trying to do, of course, is to get best available or most feasible solutions based on good evidence and some kind of agreement about strategic directions and values. But governments sometimes settle for less than good. Sometimes they avoid the issue in various ways, as in the first point on this slide. Sometimes they take a very complex and difficult problem and try and turn it into something that is administratively simple in order to make some kind of progress on the issue. And sometimes they take a more political view about declaring that a tough issue constitutes an urgent threat that requires centralised executive action. And this tends to then leave out a lot of the actors or the stakeholders. It tends to be a very top-down and sometimes coercive response to the crisis. But sometimes, and I think this is a source of hope for us all, governments will be more humble and they will confess that maybe these are very difficult issues, maybe the solutions are not so clear, and maybe we need to pay more attention to the knowledge uncertainty and the differing perspectives that persist on some of these big issues, and to move forward to reduce uncertainty and to try and get more agreement about values and goals and objectives. And in that case, governments are more likely to commit to serious engagement with various stakeholders with a view to sharing information and building the knowledge base and clarifying the diverse perspectives so that sources of disagreement are actually made evident, and working towards closer agreement. We'll probably never have perfect agreement, but moving towards closer agreement about goals and objectives, about strategies, and various forms of cooperative action to deal with these very difficult and shared issues. Next slide, please. So some of you will be saying, well, surely we actually know a lot. Surely we know that science can show us the way on many issues. Surely we have decades of research and shared experience that provides a secure base for problem solving. And I'm very sympathetic to this point of view. I've written quite a lot about evidence-informed policymaking, and certainly the role of science and sound knowledge is incredibly important. Science can indeed provide a lot of rigorous knowledge and expertise, providing high levels of certainty on many particular issues. There's a lot of value in investing in the analysis of trends and developments, explaining causal factors that are contributing to various kinds of problems, and then providing evidence-based solutions. And importantly, in the modern era, expertise and science are also greatly needed to counter what we all see as a real problem, the tidal wave of disinformation and propaganda around many of the important issues of the day. So science can also help us, importantly, to tackle difficult issues where there is multi-level complexity, where the systems are very complex and interactive, and they can help us grapple with the risk factors and increase our capacity for learning. Next slide, please. But science can take us so far and can't do the whole job. Science needs helpers. It needs government, it needs international organisations, it needs stakeholders to help to broker some progress on these difficult issues. Some of my colleagues in the research business would like to say that we could have evidence-based policymaking. And I think there's a bit of a consensus more recently to say evidence-based is probably too difficult. What we're really talking about is evidence-informed policymaking, where we bring to the table the best available evidence, which in some cases will have some gaps and there may be some contestation about the evidence. Importantly, a lot of evidence is not held by the research community, it's held by stakeholders and citizens. And much of the relevant evidence on many, particularly social issues, is what I call experiential. It's based on people's experience, and it's gathered through qualitative surveys and interviews and workshops rather than from big databases. Sometimes the democratic legitimacy of decision-making is called into question if the decisions are all being made by scientific experts or technocrats. And there is a big debate about avoiding the worst forms of elitism, which are seen to be exclusionary. Science also stops at a certain point in the decision-making process because science itself cannot do the prioritising. It can't itself adjudicate between policy choices, and it can't navigate the trade-offs between various values and so forth. And in some cases, the experts will disagree. So science is not a unity. It's not something that we can rely on for all the answers to all the questions. And of course, we're all familiar with the point that politicians and people in the media select evidence in a cherry-picking way to suit their own agendas. So in short, we all know that the political process, decisions by government, democratic debate is necessary to provide the negotiated trade-offs in policy decision-making and puzzling out the sequence and the timing of necessary reforms. Next slide, please. So moving along quickly, for example, if you look at the recent COVID pandemic, it's not just one thing. As I said much earlier, in the COVID crisis, governments had to decide where to draw the line between priorities for health, priorities for economics, and priorities around the everyday life and the rights of citizens. And these sorts of debates are not entirely able to be resolved simply through better knowledge or through science. Next slide, please. So here I'm going out on a limb and suggesting to you what a UNESCO perspective on good policy making might entail, and you're very welcome to say I don't know enough about this, or that the 5 criteria I've mentioned here aren't the things that you think are the most important things, but this would be something that I would like to put on the table as things for you to be thinking about in your own time, not necessarily debating with myself. But ideally, perhaps policy solutions that are good solutions would be ones that are politically supportable within countries and more internationally. Economically, they make sense, they're good value, they're effective. They would be ethically fair, which brings up the point in the title of my talk about inclusivity as well as growth. Effective in delivering benefits. This is a knowledge thing as well as a political thing. We need to know about what's more effective, and we want the outcomes and benefits and results to be delivered well. And importantly, given the kind of crisis conditions that we live in, we need to have policies that are able to be flexible and adapted over time, so that we don't have to go back to the beginning every time to have the same debate all over. We need to build in adaptability and flexible capabilities. Okay, next slide, please. So there's some criteria that I talk about with my own students and my colleagues, and we debate this quite a lot. My suggestion to you is that a lot of the complex and rapidly changing problems don't have one simple, easy answer. That the wicked problems I've been describing to you don't fit a standard pattern. Certainly we need evidence-informed policy processes, and certainly we need to use best available evidence from many sources, including the voices of experience from the disadvantaged and excluded groups. But the knowledge base is not something that is simply given to us. It's something that needs to be refreshed. It needs to be constructed. It evolves over time, and it requires continuous and a collective effort. Next slide, please. Sometimes I've suggested that people who are the knowledge experts are not listened to. Their advice is not given. It's certainly at the discretion of political leaders and government leaders to make their own decisions about how to proceed, and that is their right and entitlement. Sometimes they decide that this is not such an important issue, so they avoid it, or they blame others for the issue. Sometimes they go down the track of introducing small or symbolic policies rather than tackling the grand issues. Sometimes they focus on a small, manageable piece of the problem, which is a very understandable thing to do, that at least some incremental process on some part of the problem is better than doing nothing. And quite often governments have their own views, ideologically informed views perhaps, about what a good solution should look like. And the policy literature, the academic literature, talks quite a lot about why leaders would not take the advice of science, why they would not take the advice of best available evidence. I won't go through those kind of reasons that come through in the research literature, but you can probably recognise some of that in the examples you're interested in. Next slide, please. So, alternatively, and I think this is really the main message of my talk today, with the assistance of organisations like your own organisation that is committed to good evidence and inclusive discussion, working hand in glove with people of goodwill who are interested in good knowledge and sharing knowledge, we can commit to more open-ended processes. Not sure what happened to the slides then, but what I'm talking about here is that we need to perhaps respond in a way that is committed to open-ended policy discussion. I'm on slide 18 if you're trying to catch up. That's the one, thank you. If we want to promote open-ended discussion processes, then we need to think quite seriously about how to cope with inevitable conflict and disagreement. And my own view that I've developed over a number of years is that more collaboration is really important and useful. Some people talk about the language of co-design. It's really the same kind of idea. How do we deal with two things? One is dealing with different points of view, and the other one is dealing with gaps in our knowledge and understanding so that we draw upon best available knowledge and experience from a wide range of people who may have insights that could be valuable for understanding and solving the problem. So there are various kinds of ways to proceed. One is to think about consultation and advisory mechanisms. One is to think about commissioning major inquiries of some kind, particularly the kinds of inquiries that are not just run by a handful of experts, but where submissions are being sought from many citizens and stakeholders and groups that have knowledge to bring to the table. And exploring a variety of inclusive forums that promote engagement and a co-design of possible solutions to these complex and evolving problems. And also to explore various other kinds of mechanisms to help us deal with what are the social norms or values that we can draw on, behaviour changes approaches based on incentives and nudges, and thinking about voluntary codes and standards that might help us share a more common approach. Thank you. Next slide. So inclusive processes can be very helpful. There are many champions of collaboration and inclusion. Many international organisations like UNESCO champion these kinds of things. And it's important for us to understand how collaborative processes work effectively under the conditions of contestation and disagreement. So I'll leave it there and allow us to move to the discussion. Thank you very much.